Welcome, everybody. It's lovely to see you, and I'm glad that you're joining us. We are here continuing with the Shah Learning Center's sessions for a new month, the month of March. And amazingly, we've just come off of the back of Purim. And I don't know about you, but it feels like Purim is still busy in the air. In the city of Jerusalem, they were celebrating only today, Shushan Purim. And what that means for the rest of us is that no sooner has Purim ended that we are straight into Passover. And for some, that means getting your kitchen in order. For some, that means getting your Haggadah in order. And of course, it's both. And we are so privileged and fortunate to be able to welcome Rabbi Alex Israel here with us today. While this might be a small group who are watching live, if you're watching this recording, and for those of you who are here with us live, Alex is a dear beloved friend and also an exceptional rabbi and teacher, now internationally. Here, located in Israel, teaches and directs the educational program at Yeshivat Eretz Hatzvi. Also teaches at Midreshet Lindenbaum and is also at the Pardes Institute of Jewish Studies in Jerusalem, and has lectured in Jewish campuses and communities around the world. He broadcasts daily. So here's something else for you to pick up on. He broadcasts daily on the Tanakh Podcast and has written 2 volumes on the Book of Kings. Without any further ado, because I want to hand over to our teacher, who's going to get into an exceptional new perspective on the 4 sons from the Bible to the Haggadah, it's my honor and privilege to invite Rabbi Alex Israel.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Fishman. And I've seen the whole program that you've put together for the Learning Center, and it's really an incredible achievement. So I just want to say, really excited to be with all of you, those people who are here live and those people listening to the recording. And really thank you, Rabbi Fishman, for inviting me. So as the rabbis say that 30 days before the Chag, we're meant to start studying about the Chag. And here we are. 30 days before Pesach. Please don't get too uptight about it. It's all going to be okay. I just saw a post once about somebody who said that his wife gave birth a week before Pesach, and with the pregnancy and everything, they hadn't had a chance to clean the house, and then the baby's born, and he said he went to his rabbi and said, "How do I clean the house for Pesach?" And his rabbi said, "Just sweep the house, and the house will be kosher for Pesach. The kitchen's another matter." So that's so we shouldn't panic. There are always some shortcuts. Okay, we are going to start looking at one of the iconic texts of Pesach, and I'd even argue not just an iconic text of Pesach, but it's an iconic text of Jewish being. This has reached beyond the Seder. And I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. And I already apologize because we've called this the 4 sons in our publicity material. And then I noticed that Rabbi Sachs in his work calls it with a sort of gender neutral. He speaks about the 4 children, not the 4 sons. The question, of course, is always whether you translate banim. In Hebrew, sometimes the masculine, of course, would be sons, but you could definitely say in Hebrew that banim, like you say anashim, just means people, doesn't necessarily mean male people. So banim can be banim and banot, boys and girls, which turns into 4 children and not just 4 sons. But as I said, this is really one of the iconic texts that I probably don't even need to give this any introduction for this audience that we have here. At the Seder table, we talk about the 4 sons, and I want to deal with this text. But before that, I just want to try and meet the way that the 4 sons has been seen through so many generations. And I brought you a bunch of artistic renditions of how the 4 sons have been portrayed. If you take a look here, for example, from New York, 1920, you got the 4 sons, right? The one on the right seems like a rabbi with his books and his hat. The rebellious son, the Rasha, right, being, what is that, a boxer? A boxer. This is reminding you of sort of 1920s New York. atmosphere, with that sort of vibe. Then you've got the third along, who I think would be the simple son. And I'm not sure what makes him simple, but he's definitely somebody who maybe doesn't really know his Jewish identity. Maybe we might call this an acculturated American Jew. And then, of course, we have a child. And it's interesting that the Enoyod, the child who doesn't know how to ask, is frequently, all the others are adults. Do you notice? It's always, who doesn't know how to ask? And they always assume a child. Well, we'll have to challenge that in our class next week. I'll give you an outline of what I'm going to do in the classes, but I just want to share these renditions. By the way, where did I take them all from? There's a wonderful Haggadah called the Shechta Haggadah, called Art, History, and Commentary. And these artistic collection was put together by somebody called Rabbi David Galinkan. Rabbi David Galinkan is actually the head of the Shechta Institute in Israel. He is probably the leading halakhic authority, one of the leading halakhic authorities today in the conservative movement, and certainly in the conservative community here in Israel. But his claim to fame in this regard is that he loves art, and he put together a Haggadah, which gave loads and loads of different artistic renditions of all different segments of the Haggadah, and it's called the Shechta Haggadah. And he's got a wonderful, it's a beautiful Haggadah with a lot of artistic stuff in it. So that's where I took this from. Take a look at this lovely one from Budapest, 1924. And here again, I think you're going to have to go, if we know the wise son, the wicked son, this is the order we have in our Haggadah. Wise son, wicked son, simple son, and who doesn't need to ask. So what we have here is, of course, I think here it goes from left to right. Interesting, the wise son. How would you describe him here? I don't know if he's particularly religious, but I guess we'd describe him as, give me a word. Maybe thoughtful, pensive, right?
Learned.
Maybe learned, right? Sitting there, intense. Then we've got, the next sung along to the right, looks a little bit of got a little bit of chutzpah or something a little cheeky, a little rebellious. Then they're getting younger and younger, right? The simple son with his eyes wide open and his mouth wide open. And then the child, just the youngest of all, doesn't know how to ask, right? So is this, are we going down in age? Let's take a look at this one. I love this one. This is a Haggadah from Tel Aviv from 1955. And it's a religious Haggadah. It's not a secular Haggadah, which there are secular Haggadot, but it's a religious Haggadah. If you take a look here, the Chacham is on the top right, and the Chacham is carrying with him he's like a religious Zionist. He's somebody who has, if you look there, his menorah and his 10 Commandments, and he's wearing a kippah. But he's definitely a Zionist. He's not. Whereas then you have, who is the Rasha, the evil person? He's the secular Zionist, right? The secular Zionist, or maybe even worse than that, God forbid, he isn't a kibbutznik, right? But he is a city dweller with a Tel Avivian with his tie on and his shirt, right? And in the background is all the chalutziyut. And they're saying, these are the Risha'im, these are the evil ones, right? These are the ones who have rejected tradition. The simple son is maybe a new immigrant who doesn't yet have his identity cast out. He hasn't quite decided who he is. He's a young boy. You see, he's carrying a top left. He's carrying a flower. He's carrying a flower, a person wondering how he's going to be in the land of Israel. And then look at the child who doesn't know how to ask, which I find is so interesting. Who is that? Haredi child. Why is he the child who doesn't know how to ask, right? He's not even maybe part of the Zionist enterprise. And that is what this Haggadah is saying, right? At least the simple son says, Mazot, what's all this about? He's curious. But the Haredi child is out of the game, right? Out of the game. Again, fascinating.
Rabbi, why do you think שאינו יודע לשאול is a Haredi child? He says, מה זאת? מה זאת אומרת? Is a Haredi child necessarily, do you think?
Well, I see the child in the bottom left, and he has a black kippah and he has peyot. So that's why I'm saying he looks Haredi, and he doesn't. I assume the answer is that he's not even asking a question about this. He's on the sidelines. Now, but by the way, this isn't talking about Passover. This is talking about a new redemption, right? A modern redemption. And what they're saying is the Chacham is not, I don't know if he's Chacham, I don't know if he's wise, but what he's wise in is he's actually taking part in all of this. The Rasha, the evil child, has rejected the tradition, but he's part of Israel, which is interesting. The simple son has just walked off the boat, wondering what he's going to do there. But the child who doesn't know how to ask, of course he knows how to ask about a lot of other things, but he doesn't know how to ask about anything to do with Zionism because he's not part of it. What I'm simply trying to show you is the way that this has been so popular to, everybody's trying to put their ideologies in, whether it's New York in 1920, whether it's Israel in 1955. I'll give you another one, which I find quite haunting. This is from something, I'll make it a little smaller. This is from the Holocaust Tagala. Did you know there was a Holocaust Tagala? And the Holocaust Tagala doesn't even give any sort of human face to all of this. What you first have is, and again, we're going to have to guess which one is which, right? In the bottom left, right? So which one's that? Chacham, Michaela is saying, right? The bottom left is the Chacham. He's got the book open. He's willing to read. He's going to study. Okay. If we go, clockwise here, the one on fire is probably the Rasha, right? Is probably the Rasha. And I guess what it's saying is his Judaism's gone up in smoke, gone up in fire, along with the inferno of the Holocaust. Then you have a book open with blank pages, and maybe that is the simple son, I don't know. And then you've got a book which is closed, right? Now, by the way, it could be that the book which is closed is the Rasha, right? It could be the book which is closed is the evil son who's already closed the book. I don't know. Maybe it's the one on fire who doesn't know how to ask, because the one who doesn't know how to ask is just overwhelmed. What I'm trying to show you is how so many people have read into this text so much about their world. Okay? Whether it's Israel in the 50s, whether it's New York in the 20s, whether it's post-Holocaust. And I just put this one also, interesting, sort of Art Deco type, Tel Aviv, 1954. Yeah, I assume at the right you have the Chacham with a beard. I'm not quite sure who the Rasha is here. Maybe the one in the middle, although he's wearing a kippah, the one in the middle. But I find it very interesting that always the child who doesn't know how to ask is a child, according to everybody. Always they produce the child who, the one who doesn't know how to ask always seems to be a child.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
The child who doesn't know how to ask, is the text in Hebrew literally mean child?
Let's take a look. I'm scrolling down so we can look at the text in the Haggadah. And in the if you look here, it's right in front of you. Okay? The phrase is here. Sorry. The Torah speaks of 4 children. Keneged arba banim. 4 children the Torah speaks. 1 wise, echad chacham, echad rasha, 1 wicked, echad tam, the echad she'eni yodeh shalom, 1. And again, here you're very correct. It says again it says a child, but in the Hebrew it doesn't mention child. It just says somebody who doesn't know how to ask. Right now, they're all meant to be sons or children, but we're all children, right? We're adults and we're still children, right? So it doesn't stress that it's a child. And once again, at the end, also, it doesn't say that it is a child. So I'll just point that out. You are correct to point out that I've been keep on talking about the child who doesn't know how to ask, but the phrase in Hebrew is, oops, I'll do that again. The phrase in Hebrew is she'eno yodea lishal, right? Here they've added in the English, the child, but it's really he who does not ask a question, right? He who does not ask a question. But it doesn't stress that that's a child any more than any of the others. Okay, so this has been our introduction. We better get it moving because we've got a lot to do today. But I wanted to stress we're going to spend our 3 classes together. Today we're going to talk about the Midrash. How do we come up with these 4 children, or 4 sons, or 4 whatever we're going to call them? Then we're going to next time talk about alternative readings, because a lot of people always look at the Chacham as the good one, and all the others are in some way deficient. The next time we're going to, who's the opposite of the Chacham? Is it the Rasha or the Tam? And we're going to look at a lot of Hasidic readings, who read the alternative and Israeli poetry, who read the other children as the heroes of the day, and not just the wise son. So we're going to do that next week. And then what we're going to do for our 3rd class is it's going to be called, not just sons, but daughters. And we're going to look at the role of women in the story of the Exodus and the famous statement of the rabbis, Bizchut Nashim Tzidkoniot, that we came out of Egypt because of the righteous women. Who are these righteous women? And the role of women who seem to have a disproportionate role in the Exodus. So that's our plan. So today's class is to try and figure out how we get into this Midrash. Don't get too dizzy as I scroll. How do we get to understand where do these 4 sons come from? Where are they from? So I'm going to do 2 introductions. And in order to express two bits of introduction, and then we're going to really get to work. The first is what I've called here on our page 3, the law. And what's the law? Ask questions. What do I mean? What are we meant to do on Leil HaSeder, on the night of the Seder? What are we meant to do? Who made the rules? Who made the structure? So we all get a book, it's called a Haggadah, and we follow whatever it says. But the laws are actually set down in a very ancient text, which is the Mishnah. The Mishnah, going back 2,000 years, maybe what we might call the first code of Jewish law after the Torah. And here it tells us, the first cup we raise on the night of Seder, like every Achag, is Kiddush. We make Kiddush on the wine. But then it says this, so I hope people can see on the sheet. The second cup is poured, and here the child asks. There's this sense that the child has to ask a question, even before anybody teaches him anything. And if the child has no intelligence, the father teaches him, right? You know that text, I assume. Maybe you've known it since you were 5 years old, right? And it says, according to the intelligence of the child, the father teaches him. And what does he teach him? We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and starts teaching all the story. But you can see what I've highlighted here. And here the child asks. There seems to be a principle that children need to ask questions on this night. Where do we get that from? Where does that come from? Number 2, I want to expand this notion of questions with the help of Maimonides. Okay? And if we're going to look at over here, I'll highlight the text we're looking at. I hope you can see where I've just highlighted. The Rambam, Maimonides, we're talking about 100 years after the Mishnah, 1,000 years after the Mishnah, articulates what we mean. How do we get a child to ask? So let's read. I'm going to make this a bit bigger, actually. Hold on a second. Let's make it a little larger. For those of you who are, okay, here we go. But tzarich lasot shinui balayla hazeh. We need to make changes or stimulate difference on this night. So the children will see and be motivated to ask. I think what we're really talking about is a word which you might call curiosity, arousing interest, whetting the intellectual appetites. In other words, it's much better if I turn around to my child and say, I need to read you a story now. They're not going to be very happy. But if they come to me and say, Daddy, please read me a story, and I'm like, oh, I'm too tired. No, read me that story, right? Then they're on the game. How do we arouse intellectual curiosity? So let's see what in other words, the Ram says we don't really want to force a child to learn. We want a child to already be asking questions. Why? So that we can answer them. This and this occurred, right? The key of education. How do you get a child to wake up and want to learn by themselves? And he says, what changes should be made? So first of all, he says a little bit of bribery, right? Give them roasted seeds and nuts, right? Imagine that you've got, something that you like, granola sort of thing, roasted seeds and nuts. You know what you should do, they say? Take away the table before they eat. In other words, set the table. Everybody used to have in Roman times, for example, they used to be on a couch and they had a little stool next to their couch. So he said, everybody's expecting to have their dinner. And then what happens is they take away the table. Take away the table before they eat. Matzot should be snatched from one to the other. That's the Afikoman game, right? You know that one. And it even says if a person doesn't have a son, his wife should ask him. If he doesn't have a wife, then whoever's with him at the Seder should ask. Why is this night different? And this applies even if they're all wise. Listen to this even better. If, and hopefully nobody is in this situation, but if you are by yourself, ask yourself a question. Questions. This is the night of question. We can't come to the story of the Exodus without a sense of healthy curiosity, without a sense of looking for something new. Where does this all come from? So I want to answer that question in just a few minutes. But first, I need to do a second introduction, and then we'll get to the work. Second introduction I want to talk about is, what is Midrash? I know that's a big topic, and I've given sometimes a whole course about what is Midrash. But I need to explain a few words about Midrash. Now, if I asked you guys, what is Midrash? I wonder what you would say. Anybody's welcome to write in the chat if they would like. What is Midrash? I frequently hear people say, what is Midrash? It is not the literal interpretation. What does that mean? So I want to describe to you what is Midrash with one short example. I tried to bring an example from the story of the Exodus because I thought that would be useful. Let me explain a little bit what is Midrash. When we talk about Midrash, what we mean. Midrash is frequently a technique of reading biblical verse. Oh, lovely. Somebody's written in the chat. Right? Hannah wrote, Midrash is lo hapshat, right? Not the literal interpretation. Exactly. So I understand what it's not, but what is it? So frequently, what Midrash is going to be, yeah, Hannah. Welcome to Anne.
תודה.
I'm not hearing. So
אני
what we have
שומעת
here
אותך,
is...
אני שומעת,
okay.
הרב.
No problem. Great. מצוין. So what we have here is an interesting story I want to share with you. And I want to ask you where it comes from. Here's the story about Moses, young Moses. Once a small little lamb, I hope you can see this at the bottom of page 3. Once a small little lamb ran away from the flock. Moshe chased and caught her near a shady spring. When Moshe saw the lamb drinking, he said, I didn't know that you were running away because you were thirsty. You must be tired. Moshe then carried the lamb on his shoulders back to the herd. God concluded, if you have compassion to lead a human being's sheep, you should also take care of my sheep, the Jewish people. Lovely story. And this story comes from a famous Midrash known as Shemot Rabbah. Now, you will never find this story in the Bible. It is not there. So who made it up and where did it come from? And I want to play a little game with you. We're going to read the biblical text and you're going to tell me, what's the problem? Okay, take a look at the text which you see now in front of you. This is the text. We're going to read two verses which precede the famous scene at the burning bush. It says like this, Moshe was tending the flock of his father-in-law Yitro, who was the priest of Midian. He drove the flock past the wilderness. And he came to the mount of God, to Horev. And the angel of God appeared to him from a blazing fire out of a bush. In other words, this is the famous story where God appears to Moses with a burning bush. What's the question? The question is, what's the Midrash bothered by? Why do we need so much detail in verse 1? Couldn't it have said, Vayehi Moshe Bamidbar? Moses was in the wilderness. If we would have just said, Vayehi Moshe Bamidbar, and God appeared to him, an angel of God appeared to him in a burning bush, wouldn't that be enough? Why do we need to hear that Moses was a shepherd of the sheep of Jethro, and he drove all the sheep to the back of the wilderness, and he came to Har Elohim Chorev? What's all that detail? We always say the Torah is very careful with language. What is the text? How are they reading the text? First of all, I'll tell you how they're reading the text. Notice the word here, son, twice, right? It says he's shepherding the sheep and he takes the sheep, right? Now in English, just like in Hebrew, the word sheep can mean lots of sheep, or it can be a sheep, right? It can be a plural or a singular. So how are they reading this verse? They're reading it this way. The first one, son, without the definite article, is sheep in the plural. The second one is hatzon, the sheep, the particular sheep. Here, this is how we're going to read it. Moses was shepherding all the flock of his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and one sheep went to the back of the wilderness because it was looking for water. And it went all the way to the mountain of God, which is called Horev. But in Hebrew, the word Horev means dry. In other words, there was a thirsty sheep. And Moses brought him all the way back to the mountain of God. They're creating a story. Now they're remembering something else about Moses. When Moses was about to die, and God was appointing a new leader, what did God say to him? God said, Moses, you're going to die. And let's look at this verse. Moses said to God, appoint a man over the community. Appoint a new leader over the community who will go out before them and come in before them. That God's community may not be like a sheep that have no shepherd. By the way, it says, who will bring them out, who will take them out and bring them in. How does Moshe know so well about shepherding? Because he took a sheep out and brought it in. Now, what do we call this in English? This is called gap filling. This is called gap filling And this is called playing with the language. And this is what Midrash always does. Midrash sees something extra in the verse. Now, I want to say something here. If you are into pshat, if you're into translation, you can translate that verse we saw perfectly. There's no problem in translation. The question we have is, why do we need all that detail? And the Midrash comes up with an answer. Midrash always does three things. Number one, it finds a textual problem. Number two, it creates a new story. Number three, it makes something relevant. The question was, why do we have that extra verse? Why is it important that Moses was a shepherd? And why is it important he went to the back of the wilderness? And why does it call two words for Har Chorev? Har Elohim and Har Chorev. It creates a new story by telling us about a sheep and remembering that Moses looks at leadership in terms of shepherding. And of course, the message is that Moses is the leader who cares about every one of Israel. God doesn't need a miracle maker. God doesn't need a prophet. He needs a caring individual. And it's the person who cares who will become the Redeemer of Israel. Now, is this in the verse or is this not in the verse? That's exactly the art of Midrash. Because the people of Midrash will say, well, of course, it's not in the verse, but it sort of is. Because why was that language used? Why was that imagery chosen? Why did God put this as the verse which is literally the prelude to God's selection of Moses? It's there because it tells us something we couldn't have learnt otherwise. And that's the art of Midrash. Now, what I'm going to claim today is that we have the pshat, the literal reading, and the drush. And that the story of the four sons is a drush. So let's remind ourselves of the story. We're going to read it very quickly from the Haggadah, and then we're going to look at the sources in the Tanakh. Everybody with me? Great, let's go. The Torah speaks of four children. Okay, I'm looking at the text of Haggadah, which you see in front of you now. One wise, one wicked, a simple child, and a child who knows not how to ask. Chacham Mahu Omer, what does the Chacham say? He says, and let's pay attention to this question. Ma idut v'mishpatim asher tziva, hachukim v'mishpatim asher tziva, Hashem Elokeinu etchem. I want you to notice, what are the laws, statutes, and guidelines that God commanded you? Where is this question from? From Deuteronomy, chapter 6. We're going to look at that in a minute. So what do we explain to him? He's a wise son. What do we say to him? We explain the laws of the Afikoman. You're not allowed to eat after the taste of the Afikoman. That's the question, that's the answer. Wicked child. I'm sure you all know this pretty well it looks like most of you aren't just 12 years old. You've been at a lot of Seders, and I'm sure you know this text pretty well. But I'm going to go through it just for those who... The wicked child says, what is this service to you? Ma avodah zot lachem. Notice this comes from Exodus chapter 12. Exodus chapter 12, verse 26. We're going to come back to that. And he emphasizes you and not himself. By excluding himself from the community, he denies a basic principle of Judaism, the notion of the collective. What is this for you, says the Rasha. And what do? Haket shinav, smash him in the teeth and say, and now let's do. Very interesting. The first came from Exodus 12, but now we quote him a verse from Exodus 13. What's going on? It's because of this that God acted for me when I went out of Egypt. For me and not for him. What's the bottom line? If he had been there, he wouldn't have been redeemed. The simple child says, and again, here you have a source, Exodus chapter 13. What is this? And you reply, with a mighty hand, God took us out of Egypt, the place of persecution and slavery. Okay. Child who doesn't know how to ask a question doesn't ask a question, right? Because he doesn't know how to ask questions. So what do? You open up the conversation. And what do you open it up with? As it says, You should tell your child on the self-same day, that is to mark what God did for me when I came out of Egypt. Now, if you're paying attention, you will notice that the verse here, this is to mark what God did for me when he came out of Egypt, is the same verse here. Same verse, same Hebrew. We give the same verse to the Rasha as we do the Enoyod, same answer, but we analyze it differently. So what's going on? So now I'm going to summarize everything we've done so far. Number one, what do we say? We said, number one, this is the night of questions. Number two, we have these 4 sons. Where do they come from? And what are these answers? Answers are skipping around. What's going on? And look at the beginning phrase here. What does it say? Keneged arba banim dibra Torah. The Torah speaks of 4 children. Does it speak of 4 children? Well, let's see. So now we're going to go to the Torah. I'm going to start off in this order, even though it's not the order of the Torah, because it's the order of this Haggadah. Let's read. So Deuteronomy 6. When your son asks you in a time to come. By the way, it's already interesting. This is Deuteronomy, the end of the 40 years of the wilderness. And they're saying, you know what? You're going to be in the land of Israel in a future time. And your son's going to say to you, what are these testimonies, these laws, these statutes that God gives you? And if you just had that question, what is the Chacham asking about? Is he asking about Pesach? Sounds like he's asking, what is this Judaism thing, right? What's Judaism about? You know, Dad, you put on tefillin in the morning. We go to synagogue on Shabbat. We, won't eat in certain restaurants. What are all these laws? So then you say to your son, you know what? You probably recognize this line. We were Pharaoh's bondsmen in Egypt, and the Lord brought us out with Egypt with a mighty hand to give us the land he swore to his forefathers. And the Lord commanded us to do all these statutes to fear the Lord our God, for our good always. He might preserve us alive as it is today. So this is really interesting. This is the question of the Chacham, but is this the answer? Not at all. The son's saying, why do we do all of this? And what's the father saying? Well, you know what? Once we didn't have an independent nation, but God brought us out of Egypt. He gave us the land, and this is a culture. This is our culture. This is the culture that God gave us. He gave us our freedom. He gave us our land. And look, you see, we were Pharaoh's bondsmen. The Lord brought us out of Egypt. He gave us the land, and he commanded us. This is who we are. Freedom, land, culture. And you know what? It'll be even more than that. It's going to preserve us alive as to this day. This is what keeps us in good shape. I hope you notice that this is not the answer of the Chacham. And this guy, by the way, doesn't even sound so Chacham. Does he sound Chacham to you? He just sounds curious to me. Interesting. All right, let's take a look at the next one. Moses called, I'm just going in order of the Seder, okay? But let's just read this passage. Shemot chapter 12. Moses called the elders of Israel and he said to them, take your lambs according to your family and kill the Passover lamb, slaughter the Passover lamb. Take a bunch of hyssop, dip it into the blood in the basin and strike the lintel and the side posts with blood. And the Lord will pass through to smite the Egyptians. The Lord will pass over the door. And now, so what is this? This is the idea of the Paschal lamb, the Passover lamb, right? The Pesach, the Korban Pesach. And then what does he say here? You shall observe this thing for an ordinance for your sons forever. By the way, already the notion of children. And it will come to pass when your children say to you, Ma avodah hazot lachem. Your children will say to you, what is this? Why are you bringing a lamb every spring? What are you doing? And what do you say? By the way, it's called Pesach, and Pesach means to jump, to leapfrog. And you'll say it's a sacrifice of the Lord's Passover, because he passed over our houses to the children of Israel in Egypt.
But Rabbi, that sounds like Rasha. מה העבודה הזאת לכם?
Exactly. This is the question of the Rasha. But I want to ask you a question. Does he sound like a Rasha here? I think he sounds like just what did we say before? A curious child. He goes every year. He's 3, he's 4, he's 5, he's 6, maybe easier now. He's 17. And he says, you know, Dad, we go to Mom, Dad, we go to Jerusalem and bring the Paschal Lamb. Why? And you say, you know what? This Paschal Lamb is called Pesach, Passover, because God passed over our houses. I don't know what age this goes on. Maybe when you're 3 and 4, and when you're 6 and 7, and when you're 17 and 18. Do you hear a Russia here? I don't. All right, let's keep going.
You don't hear, but it's the same word that he uses.
For sure. For sure.
זה אותם המילים.
בדיוק. So what I'm actually going to be claiming is, Hannah, I'll give you the bottom line that I'm trying to get to. There is a pshat and there is a drush. There's what the text says, and there's the way that we play with the text, and we bring new things out. The first one, the question that we called the Chacham, was about why do we keep the whole Torah? Why do we have a Jewish lifestyle? This is about Passover. Why do we do the Paschal Lamb? Here, I'll show you the next question. Take a look at this one. Shemot 13. It says, when the Lord will bring you into the land of Canaan, set aside unto the Lord all that open the wombs. Every firstling that is male shall be God. And the firstborn of man among your sons you shall redeem. What is this? This is the idea of the Bechor, that we have a tradition, the firstborn animals and firstborn males are all going to be dedicated to God. Right? Maybe you've been to a Pidyon Haben. So a human baby we obviously redeem, and animals we offer up in the temple. So let's say, for example, you're in the farm and you've got a cow and it's his first cut. The cow gives birth to a calf. You're going to consecrate that to God. So verse 14 here. And when your son will ask you, notice a lot of children asking a lot of questions. When your son asks you in time to come, saying, Ma zot, right? He says, what is this? Notice again the notion of asking. He says, what is this? Then say to him, you know why? By strength of the hand. And it came to pass when Pharaoh would hardly let us go, that the Lord slew the firstborn in the land of Egypt, but both the firstborn of man and the firstborn of beasts. And therefore I sacrifice to the Lord all that opens the womb, being males, but the firstborn of my sons I redeem. So the question of the Tam, the question of the simple son, Ma Zot, is actually a good question. Just like the previous son, question of the Rasha was saying, he's not a Rasha. The question of Ma Vod was saying, why do we do a Paschal Lamb? Here, this son is saying, why are you doing the firstborn? Reasonable question. I don't hear a simple son. I hear an observant, curious son. And we give him a very sophisticated answer. By the way, in the Haggadah, we will see what we answer him, but it's a much longer answer. Do you see? It's not just a one-liner. We say, by the strength of the hand, the Lord brought us out of Egypt from the house of bondage. And when Pharaoh would hardly let us go, he slew all the firstborn. And that's why I sacrifice. Okay, let's look at the last one, which is meant to be the She'eno Yodea Lishol. Why is it the She'eno Yodea Lishol? Because there's no question. So let's just take a look at the text from Shemot chapter 13. When God brings you into the land of Canaan, the land of all those nations, you get to springtime. And what do you do then? Shivat yamim tochal matzot. Unleavened bread shall be eaten throughout 7 days. There should be no leavened bread within your borders. Now, by the way, it's the time of the harvest. You might think we'd celebrate bread by making lovely bread, but we make flat bread. We make unleavened bread. And maybe your child doesn't even ask. So, you know what? Educate him. What did it say? Here, there's no question. Tell your son, saying, you know why we're doing this? Because of what God did to us in Egypt. And I guess the answer is, he brought us out so fast that the bread didn't have time to rise, blah, 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 blah. Keneged arba banim dibra Torah. I'm going to go back up. There are 4 questions or 4 interactions between parents and children. The first one is when the child in Deuteronomy says, what are the testimonies and statutes, ordinances? But according to the Pshat, he's really asking, what's this Judaism about? And we give him a very different answer. Avadim ayinu lefaro b'Mitzrayim. Second question is about the Passover Lamb. It's a reasonable question. And we answer him and we say, because God went over our houses. Third question is about the firstborn. Mazot, what is this? And we say, God jumped over the houses. He killed the firstborn. We dedicate our firstborn. And the last one is about matzah. 3 of them are about Pesach. 1 is not even about Pesach bichlal. And now, what, for goodness sake, is the Haggadah doing? I'm going back to the Haggadah. What is the Haggadah doing? Can we figure out what the Haggadah is trying to achieve? Any ideas? What Midrash, I want to call this a Midrash. What drush is the Haggadah doing? I said Haggadah always plays with language. And what the Haggadah is doing, I'll give you the answer. The Haggadah is decontextualizing all the questions. Right? You know what? Let's go back to our Mishnah. Do you remember the Mishnah? Let's go back to this original text, the law. This is what it says there. The second cup is poured, and here the child asks. If the child has no intelligence, the father teaches him, and the father teaches according to the child's intelligence. The rabbis wanted to express that we can't just have one story. We always have to have regard for the person sitting in front of us. So you know what they did? They took all of the 4 questions from the Torah and they created typologies. They didn't pay any attention to the context. They just paid attention to the questions. They took a question, they say, what are the laws, statutes, and guidelines that God commanded you? And they said, ooh, that guy sounds intelligent. Look, 3 phrases. Statutes, guidelines, laws. He must be a very wise, intellectual child. And by the way, they gave him a completely different answer. They gave him an intellectual answer. Oh, I'm going to learn the laws of Pesach, right? Don't eat after the Afikoman. Go connect that. This is not a particularly appealing answer. What they're saying is some people, he asked a legal question, give him a legal answer. A legal question has a legal answer. Then they go to the second question and they decontextualize it. What is this service to you? Now, as we said, in its original form, this was a question about the Paschal Lamb, and it was a reasonable question, but they decontextualized it and they focused on the phrase you, right? And now notice that the whole answer is about me and you and him. And we even give a different answer. He finds a different verse. Again, if you went to the original answer, what was the original answer? The original answer was a very nice answer. It is the sacrifice of the Lord's Passover that he passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt. Fine answer. But what are we doing in the Midrash? The Midrash is trying to say, answer each child according to his intelligence. And then they play and decontextualize the question, Ma ha'avodah hazot lachem. And they found this lachem v'lo lo. Now we always have the question in our Seder, but what about the Chacham? The Chacham also says, etchem, you. But they're not interested in that, because they were hearing with the Chacham, Eidot, Chukim, Mishpatim. The third child is Mazot. What's that? Now we know in the original context it was about the Bechor. But what they hear is a simple son, a simple question. What's that? So they give him a simple answer. What's the answer? Mighty hands. Simple person wants, bam, slapstick. Impressive. And the last one, the child who doesn't know to question, what do? You open it up for him. At petach lo. You open it up to him. And then they actually, interestingly enough, take the answer of the Rasha. What has happened here? What has happened here is that what we're trying to do, and I go back, is to teach this law. The whole thing is a midrash on this phrase in the Mishnah. Lefi da'ato shel ben aviv malamdo. The father teaches a child according to his interest, according to his intelligence. Right? Notice in the way Maimonides puts it. I'm reading this text, which is in the center of your screen. It's a mitzvah to inform one's sons, even though they don't ask. As it says, tell your son. A father should teach his son according to his son's knowledge. Lefi da'ato shel ben aviv malamdo. Ketzad, how do you do that? He says, if the son is young or foolish, he should say to him, my son, in Egypt we were all slaves, like that maidservant or that slave. You know our neighbors, they've got a slave? We used to be like him. And you know what? Then we were freed. Right? On this night, the Holy Best He redeemed us and took us out of freedom. If the son is older and wise, notice the Rambam talks about two categories, young or foolish. The Hebrew is katan or tipesh. And the other option is gadol v'chacham. It has to be age appropriate. He should inform you what happened to us in Egypt and the miracles wrought for us by our Moses, our teacher, each according to the son's knowledge. Now, I want you to understand that the Rambam is not giving the answers given in the Seder, but the Rambam doesn't care. What I want to say, as far as we're concerned, is this: when we come to the Seder, the most important thing is to meet everybody where they are. I remember one year I had a friend of mine. It was he was like 26, newly married, and he had both sets of grandparents with him and a bunch of his grandparents' friends. I said, and they weren't a learned crowd. And I said to my friend is a very creative guy. I said to my friend, Daniel, what did you do for the Seder? Did you do anything interesting? Because I know you didn't have like a bunch of yeshiva guys. He said, you know what I did? He said, I scanned the internet and I looked for famous speeches of different anti-Semites throughout history. I found a speech of St. Augustine, and I found a speech of Hitler, and I found a speech of Stalin, and I found a speech even from ancient Egypt, and I took one of the speeches from Antiochus, from Josephus, and I photocopied them and put them on everybody's places at the beginning of the Seder. And we started off by reading all these speeches about how we're going to annihilate the Jews and we're going to eradicate their memory. And that's how I opened the Seder. And I asked everyone, so how do we survive? That's the equivalent of this Midrash of the four sons. Find the hook, find the trigger, find the question that will arouse interest in the audience. You know who's around your Seder table. You've got to be tonight is the day where every person has to try and become an educator. The most important thing is not the answers, it's the questions. And that's why this Midrash actually ignores all the answers that the Torah gives us. And all it does is focuses on the questions and says, oh, you know what, let me look at the question. What type of questioner would be asking this question? That's the clever thing the Midrash does. It doesn't care what the answers the Torah says. It says, don't give the form answers. Look at the person and say, what's eating him? Why did he ask that question? Right? Oh, that person is interested in politics. That person's interested in finance. That person's a learned person. That person. And in that way, you will be able, that's what's real education. And I'll finish off with this lovely quote, which Rabbi Sachs used to like to quote. Put it on the last page here. And this famous quote by somebody called Isidore Rabi, who won the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1944. And he says, my mother made me a scientist without ever intending to. Every other mother would ask her child after school, so, did you learn anything today? But not my mother. Izzy, she'd ask, Did you ask a good question today? Asking good questions made me a scientist. I would argue that that's exactly the Midrash of the four sons. So let me try and summarize in the 2 minutes I have got left. We all know the passage of the four sons from the Seder. And it says that the Torah spoke about four sons. And indeed, the Torah did speak about four sons. But the passage in the Torah, or the four passages in the Torah, are very different from our Seder passages. And all the questions we always come to the Seder with, but this doesn't match that. What's going on? Well, we have to understand that the rabbis decided to write a new Midrash. And indeed, the Torah talks of four sons. But the rabbis and the text Haggadah basically threw into the garbage can all the answers and just cut out the questions and said, ooh, what if a person would ask this question? Oh, he's into law. Mazot, he must be a simple guy. No question? How can we? And that way, we're driving home the most important principle I know about the night of the Seder, that it's all about the questions. But more than that, you've got to get your audience to ask the questions. You've got to try and arouse everybody's interest. And the story of the four sons was the most creative text where the rabbis mix and match and play with language and imagery in order to bring home that very important message. That's it for today. Please God, next week we're going to meet again, and we're going to take those four personalities, and maybe we look at the Chacham as the best, the wise son, evil son, but we're going to look at some people who preferred maybe those three other identities and not just the wise son. So that'll be next class. A little bit of Israeli poetry and Chassidut next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Israel. Any questions or comments for Rabbi Israel at this point? Thank you so much, Rabbi Israel. Fascinating discovery of a text that is so familiar, and yet you showed us what was behind it. And I loved how you finished that the most important thing is to know your audience at the table, to be able to get them to ask a question. That is the eternal challenge. Who is coming to the table, and what are they interested in, and what can we get them to ask? It's not about us asking them. I'm sure everyone in this class has 10, 20, 100 questions they could be asking. What could we be doing to generate the questions being asked from our guests?
I once went to visit a friend of mine who's living in a moshav up north. He's a rabbi, and I went to his house on Pesach, and his house was full of suitcases. I'm not joking. He must have had in his living room 40 suitcases.
Wow.
And I said to him, "What is going on here?" He said, "Well, we had a few families who I didn't think they were so religious, so we decided to play a game, and we turned our living room into Egypt airport." And they had them all pretend they were leaving Egypt, and they were all had to ask questions like, "Why are you leaving? And what are you going? And why are you?" Like, they literally made it into an airport, so that everybody would get excited by leaving Egypt, and why were they leaving, and where were they going to, and why did they not like it? And that was probably the ultimate in trying to get someone. I don't know who they borrowed all the suitcases from, but that was quite a creative attempt at getting people to dig into themselves, to ask them whether they wanted to leave Egypt and what they would leave Egypt for. So,
wow.
I have these cards I bought years ago. They look like mini matzahs, and I put a card in everyone's plate, and on the behind is a question. So before they read, they have to look at it, ask the question, and it's a way for people who are not super observant to get into it as well. So
beautiful,
yeah.
Whatever works.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
There's going to be a sudden run at the suitcase shop now in Montreal. You watch.
Thank you.
Excellent. Have
Thank
a great
you
week,
so
everybody.
much. Thank you so much. And we'll continue next Wednesday, God willing, at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Rabbi Israel's next class. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Israel.
Very much.
Besarot tovot.
Amen.